Ethan Blake's Sunday at the pool started as a slice of tranquility. Nestled into one of the recliners, shaded by an umbrella, the heat of the sun balanced perfectly with the coolness of the breeze rippling across the surface of the water. A programming book rested in his hands, its pages swaying lazily in the breeze as he absorbed the technical complexities he loved. It was his escape, a break from the never-ending deadlines and pixelated chaos of his work as a computer programmer. The other residents around the pool mingled quietly, forming a backdrop of laughter and soft splashes. That was when Linda Carter, a middle-aged woman with a reputation as the self-proclaimed enforcer of the complex's unspoken rules, approached him. Her stride was purposeful, her mouth set in a thin, resolute line. Her sun visor framed her narrowed eyes, scrutinizing Ethan as though he were an intruder in her personal kingdom. "You live here?" Linda's tone was sharp, already tilting toward accusation. Ethan looked up from his book, puzzled but calm. "I'm sorry," he replied, placing his book on his lap. The intensity of her gaze could have cut through steel. "You're not one of the regulars here. I've lived in this complex for 10 years, and I know all the residents," she snapped. "Do you have your keycard?" Ethan hesitated, uncertain whether to indulge her power trip. "Yes, I live here," he said. His tone was measured, but firm enough to imply that he wasn't going to play along. Linda, however, was undeterred. "You're sure about that? Because we don't just let anyone use our facilities. You need a keycard to access the pool." "Prove it." Ethan remained seated. "I don't see the need to," he said, the calmness of his voice masking the growing irritation bubbling beneath the surface. By now, other poolgoers had started to notice the confrontation. Heads turned, the hum of conversation dimming as people watched the scene unfold. Linda's voice grew louder, her accusations more pointed. "If you can't prove it, I'm calling security. We don't need strangers wandering into our complex, using our amenities like they're public property." Ethan's posture stiffened. "I am not a stranger," he replied, his voice now firm enough to carry across the pool deck. He reached into his bag, pulled out his keycard, and held it up. "Here's your proof." Satisfied? But Linda didn't back down. Instead, her indignation flared. "Well, if you live here, you must be new. I've never seen you before, and I'm here every day." Her statement felt less like an explanation and more like a thinly veiled assertion of dominance. The tension in the air was palpable, and whispers began to circulate among the residents. A few exchanged glances, debating whether to step in or let the drama play out. A couple of teenagers sitting by the edge of the pool snickered, their laughter rippling through the silence like a pebble dropped in water. Ethan stood, his 6-foot frame towering over Linda, but his composure remained intact. "I don't need your permission to be here," he said, his voice low but commanding. "If you're so concerned, feel free to call security. They'll tell you exactly what I've already told you. I live here." Linda's face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. "It's not just about living here," she barked. "Residents are supposed to respect the community. You're sitting there taking up space, not interacting with anyone, and frankly, looking like you don't belong." That comment shifted the tone entirely. The underlying racism in her words was like a crack of thunder, scattering the unspoken pretenses. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Ethan's expression hardened. The teenagers who had been laughing earlier went silent, their faces now tense with discomfort. "Excuse me?" Ethan's voice was like ice, slicing through the air. "I'm just saying," Linda continued, either unaware of the gravity of her words or emboldened by the growing attention. "We're a close-knit community, and people who live here should contribute to that, not just keep to themselves." Ethan's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of every gaze, the collective judgment pressing down on him. "I work hard all week," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that demanded to be heard. "I come here to relax. I don't need to meet your standards for how to use my time or my space." The confrontation had reached its tipping point. A man in his 40s, who had been reclining on a chair nearby, finally stood. "Linda, give it a rest," he called out, his voice breaking the tension. "You're making a scene, and you're out of line." Linda turned on him, her indignation spilling over. "I'm making a scene?" I'm looking out for our community. No, the man replied. You're harassing a resident. Sit down and let people enjoy their Sunday. Linda's mouth opened as if to retort, but she seemed to realize she'd lost the crowd. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group, and a few others nodded in Ethan's direction, their subtle gestures of solidarity bolstering his resolve. Linda huffed, her face a mask of barely concealed fury, and stormed away. But the damage was done. The pool had fallen into a tense, uneasy silence, the once pleasant atmosphere now heavy with the residue of her aggression. Ethan sat back down, picking up his book with trembling hands. The tranquility he'd sought was shattered, replaced by the gnawing frustration of being singled out, humiliated, and judged in the place he called home. The pool's atmosphere hung heavy with tension as the uniformed guard approached. A burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, he carried himself with the weight of authority. His mirrored sunglasses reflected Linda's flushed face as she immediately began talking, her voice a shrill torrent of indignation. This man refuses to prove he lives here, she declared, gesturing toward Ethan like he was a criminal caught red-handed. I've never seen him before, and he's acting suspiciously. Ethan, who had returned to his reclined seat, sighed and calmly stood. The guard turned to him, his expression neutral but professional. Sir, could I see your ID or keycard? Just for verification. Ethan nodded and reached for his wallet, pulling out both his apartment ID and his keycard. Without a word, he handed them over. The guard scrutinized the cards, scanning them briefly before glancing back at Ethan. Thank you, Mr. Blake. Everything checks out. Enjoy your time at the pool. The announcement should have been the end of it, but Linda refused to relent. That can't be right, she sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. You must have made a mistake. He doesn't belong here. I know all the residents. The guard's jaw tightened slightly. Ma'am, I've confirmed his residency. He's allowed to be here. Linda's face darkened, her embarrassment fueling a stubborn rage. You can't just take his word for it. People like him. She hesitated, the words hanging dangerously in the air, but her implication was clear. Ethan's expression hardened, and murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. The guard squared his shoulders, visibly uncomfortable but holding his ground. Ma'am, he said, his voice sterner now, I've done my job. There's nothing else to discuss. Before Linda could fire back, another voice cut through the simmering tension like a blade. Oh, Linda, for heaven's sake, shut your mouth before you embarrass yourself further. All heads turned toward the far end of the pool, where Margaret Vaughn stood. Margaret was a well-known figure in the complex, an elderly widow with an iron will and a reputation for speaking her mind. Dressed in a vintage sun hat and a floral cover-up, she moved toward the commotion with a steady determination, her cane tapping against the concrete like a gavel heralding justice. Margaret's piercing eyes locked onto Linda, who visibly recoiled under the weight of her scrutiny. Do you really think we haven't noticed your antics all these years? Margaret said, her voice loud enough for the entire pool to hear. You've been pulling this nonsense with anyone who doesn't fit your idea of what a proper resident looks like. I don't know what you're talking about, Linda stammered, but her bravado was faltering. Oh, don't you? Margaret's tone was razor-sharp. Shall we start with the time you harassed the Patel family because their teenage son dared to bring his cousins to the pool? Or maybe the afternoon you accused the Suarez kids of sneaking in, when they've lived here longer than you have. Gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd as Margaret listed the incidents, each one a blow to Linda's fragile facade. Faces that had been neutral or even sympathetic toward Linda now turned cold, their owners remembering her thinly veiled prejudice. Margaret took another step forward, her voice rising. You think you're the self-appointed guardian of this place, but all you've done is make life miserable for anyone who doesn't look, act, or think exactly like you. And now you've gone and humiliated yourself in front of everyone. Linda's face crumpled, her indignation giving way to a desperate attempt at defense. I was just trying to protect our community, she cried. Isn't that what we all want? No, Margaret shot back without hesitation. What we want is a community that doesn't tolerate bigotry disguised as concern. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's lips quivered as she glanced around, searching for an ally among the crowd, but no one met her gaze. Even her usual cronies seemed reluctant to align themselves with her now. Margaret turned to Ethan, her expression softening. "Mr. Blake," she said, her tone apologetic but firm, "I'm sorry you had to deal with this. You deserve better." Ethan nodded, his jaw still clenched, but there was a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. Margaret wasn't finished. She turned back to the crowd, addressing them directly. "This is a wake-up call for all of us. If we let people like Linda dictate who belongs and who doesn't, then we've failed as a community." A slow clap broke the silence, starting with the man who had earlier tried to intervene. It spread quickly, joined by nods of agreement and murmurs of support. Linda, however, looked as though the ground beneath her might swallow her whole. Humiliated and outnumbered, she grabbed her bag and fled, her heels clicking against the concrete as the whispers and judgmental stares followed her. As she disappeared through the gate, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Conversations resumed, though they were laced with the weight of what had just transpired. Ethan sat back down, but the moment wasn't forgotten. The pool's usual tranquility had been shaken, leaving behind an undeniable truth. This wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a reckoning long overdue. Ethan sat on his couch that evening, his book abandoned on the coffee table, untouched since the poolside confrontation. The faint hum of his air conditioner filled the room, but it did little to quiet the storm brewing in his mind. He had thought the worst of the day was over after Linda's public humiliation and retreat, but it turned out the incident was far from finished. His phone buzzed incessantly on the armrest beside him, each notification a small jolt of unease. At first, he ignored it, thinking it might be the usual stream of emails and app alerts. But as the vibrations became relentless, curiosity overtook him. Picking up the device, he was greeted by a flood of messages from friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years. The first message read, "Dude, is this you? You're all over my feed." Another followed, "This is insane. I can't believe what I just watched." Someone he barely remembered from college sent a link with a simple caption, "Wow." Confused, Ethan clicked the link, which took him to a social media post from Lucas Reynolds, a young neighbor he barely knew. Lucas, always glued to his phone, had been sitting poolside that afternoon, recording the entire debacle with a steady hand and an unblinking eye for drama. The video was there in full, raw, and unedited. It started with Linda's approach, her voice sharp and demanding, her body language dripping with indignation. The camera captured Ethan's calm demeanor as he presented his ID and keycard, his restraint in the face of Linda's escalating aggression. The guard's professionalism was also visible, though his discomfort with the situation was palpable. But the real spectacle came when Margaret intervened. Her voice, unwavering and piercing, delivered an evisceration of Linda's behavior. The video had perfectly captured her cataloging Linda's history of bias, each example landing like a hammer blow. Linda's reaction, her flushed face, stammered denials, and eventual flight, was immortalized, as was the applause that followed Margaret's impassioned call for accountability. The clip ended with Linda storming out of the pool area, her figure small and defeated as she pushed through the gate. The applause faded into a murmur as the video transitioned to the comments section. Ethan stared at the growing numbers, views climbing into the hundreds of thousands within hours, comments flooding in faster than they could be read. The responses were a mix of shock, anger, and support. Many commended Ethan for his composure, calling him a model of grace under pressure. Others praised Margaret for her bravery, hailing her as a rare voice of reason and courage. But a darker undercurrent ran through the comments too. Some echoed Linda's sentiment, hiding their vitriol behind dog whistles and coded language. "Why couldn't he just show his ID and avoid the whole thing?" one comment read. "This is why communities go downhill." Another chimed in, laced with thinly veiled bigotry. These responses made Ethan's stomach churn, though he tried to focus on the overwhelming majority of positive reactions. By the time he finished watching, the video had crossed 1 million views. News outlets were already sharing it, framing the incident as a shocking example of racial bias in everyday settings. Hashtags sprouted up, from hashtag poolside prejudice to hashtag justice for them. Ethan's name trended alongside them, a fact that felt surreal as he read it on the glowing screen. Messages poured in faster than he could read them. Friends expressed outrage on his behalf, while colleagues at work assured him they were proud to know him. A few expressed concern about how this might impact him professionally, but most seemed genuinely supportive. Even strangers reached out, flooding his inbox with encouragement. Ethan couldn't shake the strange duality of it all. On one hand, the validation from so many people felt like a balm, soothing the sting of Linda's accusations. On the other, the sheer scale of attention made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a private matter anymore. It had become a public spectacle, a cultural flashpoint. He scrolled through countless tweets and comments, some dissecting the incident with surgical precision. Analysts pointed out the layers of systemic bias in Linda's behavior, using the video as a case study. Others shared personal stories of similar experiences, turning the comment sections into impromptu forums for shared pain and solidarity. But the most jarring moment came when Ethan stumbled across an op-ed written by a journalist who framed the incident as emblematic of a larger societal problem. The writer described Ethan as a man whose dignity was questioned not because of his actions, but because of the assumptions placed upon him. The words hit hard, not because they were wrong, but because they distilled his experience into something almost clinical, detached from the lived reality of the humiliation he'd endured. Ethan leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling as the notifications kept pouring in. He had never sought attention, least of all like this. His life was quiet, focused on work, with occasional escapes to the pool or hikes on the weekends. Now, he was a symbol, a talking point, an avatar for an issue he hadn't asked to represent. Yet, as unsettling as it all felt, Ethan knew this wasn't just about him anymore. The video had ignited a discussion that needed to happen, even if it came at the cost of his anonymity. He resolved to ride the wave, to respond thoughtfully to those who reached out and to let the storm run its course. But deep down, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that his life had changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. As the night wore on and the views climbed into the millions, Ethan closed his eyes, trying to drown out the relentless buzz of his phone. His face burned with the memory of Linda's sneer, the judgment in her voice, and the applause that followed Margaret's righteous fury. He was grateful for the support, but the humiliation lingered, raw and vivid, a reminder that justice often comes at a price. Ethan found himself seated in a stiff leather chair in the complex management office, his posture rigid but his expression unreadable. The air was heavy with the weight of unresolved tension. Across from him sat Linda, her face pale but defiant, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Between them, behind a polished wooden desk, sat Miss Delgado, the building manager. A poised and authoritative woman, Miss Delgado's presence commanded attention without a single raised word. The small office, with its framed certificates and bland artwork, felt suffocating. Ethan's mind churned with unease, the humiliation of the poolside incident still fresh. But there was also a quiet resolve in him, a determination to see this through, not just for himself, but for everyone in the complex who had endured similar indignities. Miss Delgado opened the meeting with an air of formality. She began by summarizing the incident, referencing the viral video, which she had clearly watched multiple times. Her tone was measured, but her eyes betrayed a simmering frustration. Ethan could see she wasn't just annoyed at Linda's behavior, she was furious about the position it had put the community in. She turned her attention to Linda, her voice steady but sharp. Linda tried to hold her composure, but the tension in her shoulders gave her away. Miss Delgado didn't mince words as she outlined the severity of Linda's actions. She spoke of the damage caused not only to Ethan but to the community's reputation as a welcoming and inclusive place. Then she began listing previous complaints against Linda, each one striking like a hammer against the fragile wall of Linda's excuses. There had been accusations of harassment against residents who didn't look like they belonged. A family from another country had reported her making them feel unwelcome at the gym. A teenager had been interrogated for using the pool, despite living with his aunt in the building. Each example built on the last, weaving a damning pattern of prejudice that Linda could no longer deny. Ethan listened, his jaw tightening with every word, as if the weight of the collective grievances bore down on him as well. Linda, however, was not the type to admit fault so easily. She attempted to defend herself, claiming she was only looking out for the community, ensuring the rules were followed. Her voice, once confident, now faltered as Miss Delgado methodically dismantled her arguments. Each justification was met with cold facts, each excuse countered with documented evidence. Linda's pale complexion grew mottled with frustration, her words tripping over themselves as she searched for an escape that wasn't there. Ethan sat silently, his restraint a deliberate choice. He didn't need to say anything, the facts spoke louder than he ever could. His presence alone was a reminder of her most public failure, a shadow looming over every weak defense she offered. What struck Ethan most, however, was the growing courage of the other residents. As word of the meeting spread, people began gathering outside the office, their voices a quiet but persistent murmur. By the time Miss Delgado called the meeting to a close, several residents had stepped forward to share their own stories. An elderly man spoke about how Linda had once questioned his guests during a family barbecue, embarrassing him in front of his grandchildren. A young woman described how Linda had confronted her boyfriend, demanding to know if he was staying overnight without permission. Each story added another layer to the picture of Linda's behavior, one that was impossible to ignore. Miss Delgado, sensing the momentum, addressed the growing group. She acknowledged that the incident at the pool had exposed deeper issues within the community. Discrimination, whether overt or subtle, had no place in their shared space. She proposed changes, a series of community events aimed at fostering inclusivity, starting with a town hall meeting where residents could voice their concerns openly. For Ethan, the announcement was a small but significant step forward. The residents seemed cautiously optimistic, their murmurs of agreement a quiet but collective affirmation. Linda, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence, the reality of her diminished standing settling heavily on her shoulders. The meeting ended with a formal warning issued to Linda, one that would remain on record. As the residents began to disperse, Miss Delgado approached Ethan privately. She expressed her regret for what had happened and thanked him for his composure throughout the ordeal. Ethan nodded, acknowledging her words, though the bitterness of the experience still lingered. Walking out of the office, Ethan was met with a mix of nods and small smiles from his neighbors. For the first time, he felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sense of solidarity that hadn't been there before. The promise of change hung in the air, fragile but real, like the first hint of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Ethan didn't expect miracles, but as he returned to his apartment, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come, and for the first time, he believed the community was willing to fight for it. Ethan stood by the grill, the smell of sizzling meat wafting into the evening air, mingling with the sound of laughter and the clinking of drinks. The courtyard, once a quiet, unremarkable space, was alive with an energy he had never seen before. Residents who had only exchanged polite nods in passing now stood together in clusters, sharing stories and laughter. The barbecue had started as an idea, half hopeful, half uncertain, but now it felt like the beginning of something transformative. The days following the meeting in the management office had been a whirlwind. Miss Delgado's proposal for inclusivity events had lit a spark in the community, but it was Margaret who pushed Ethan to take a leading role. She reminded him that the changes they all wanted wouldn't happen without action, and if anyone could rally the residents, it was the man who had endured the worst of the complex's tensions with grace. At first, the idea of organizing a barbecue seemed daunting. Ethan wasn't the type to step into the spotlight, but with Margaret's unwavering support, he found himself drafting invitations and coordinating logistics. Margaret became his co-conspirator, her strong personality and deep knowledge of the residents an invaluable asset. Together, they planned every detail from the menu to the seating arrangements, ensuring the event would be welcoming to everyone. Now, standing by the grill, Ethan watched the results of their efforts unfold. A group of kids played tag near the fountain, their laughter echoing against the walls of the complex. An elderly couple sat at one of the picnic tables, chatting animatedly with a younger woman who lived 2 floors below Ethan. He realized he had never even known her name before tonight. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the invisible wall that had divided the residents into isolated groups, wary of each other's differences. In its place was a sense of warmth and openness, as if the barbecue had given everyone permission to let their guard down. Conversations flowed naturally, some light-hearted, others more serious. People shared their experiences, small frustrations, moments of kindness, and, in some cases, stories of prejudice they had endured or witnessed. Ethan noticed the Patel family, who had been targeted by Linda in the past, speaking with the Suarez family. Their children, once wary of venturing into shared spaces, now played together as if they had been lifelong friends. Margaret, meanwhile, moved effortlessly from group to group, her presence as commanding as ever. She was a natural bridge between generations and cultures, her sharp wit and empathetic ear making everyone feel at ease. As the evening progressed, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The tension that had plagued the complex, a constant undercurrent of unease, seemed to dissolve into the warm glow of the gathering. The residents were no longer strangers inhabiting the same space. They were becoming a community in the truest sense of the word. Toward the end of the evening, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Margaret approached Ethan. She carried a paper plate piled high with food she had no intention of finishing, but her expression was serious. She stood beside him for a moment, watching the scene unfold. Then, with a subtle smile, she told him that he had done something remarkable. He had taken an unpleasant, humiliating experience and turned it into a catalyst for change. Her words were simple but carried the weight of genuine admiration, and they hit Ethan harder than he expected. He looked at her, this formidable woman who had been his first defender, and told her he couldn't have done it without her. She had been the voice that broke through Linda's tirade, the spark that turned anger into action. Margaret waved off his gratitude with a dismissive gesture, but the look in her eyes betrayed her pride. As the night wound down, Ethan took a moment to step back and absorb the scene. Residents lingered, reluctant to let the evening end. For the first time since he had moved into the complex, he felt a sense of belonging, not just to a building but to a community. He knew there was still work to be done. Building trust was a process, not an event, but tonight had proven that change was possible. When he finally returned to his apartment, tired but deeply satisfied, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. The energy of the barbecue would carry forward, shaping the future of the complex in ways none of them could yet predict. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for everyone who called the complex home.